It's amazing how a topic that seems so purely biological and medical, like cancer, can actually lead you into this deep philosophical rabbit hole.
Yeah, it really is.
When you, our listener, sent us this fascinating material on cancer from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it really got us thinking.
It did.
Because we tend to think of cancer in terms of cells and mutations and treatments, the tangible stuff.
Yeah, the nuts and bolts.
Right. But what these sources highlight is that there's this whole philosophical layer underneath it all.
Absolutely. A whole landscape of ideas that shape how we understand this complex set of diseases.
So, in this deep dive, we're not just going to rehash the biology, although we'll definitely touch on it.
Right.
We want to go deeper, explore those underlying philosophical questions and insights, like how do we even define what cancer is?
That's a big one.
How do we classify its many forms, which, as we'll see, is incredibly complicated? What's the real goal, the aim of all this scientific inquiry? And what kind of assumptions are we bringing to the table when we try to understand and treat this disease?
It turns out cancer really forces us to grapple with some very fundamental philosophical questions about science and medicine itself.
And it's worth remembering right from the start just how widespread this disease is.
Absolutely.
The World Health Organization's data tells us that cancer is a leading cause of death globally. And sadly, its impact is only increasing.
It's a huge problem.
And the amount of resources being poured into research is just staggering. In 2019 alone, the U.S. National Cancer Institute allocated over $5.7 billion to cancer research. So when you've got that much effort and resources focused on this set of diseases, it really makes you think, are we using the right frameworks to understand it? Are we asking the right questions?
Exactly. And that's where the philosophy comes in, helping us examine those very frameworks and assumptions.
So let's jump right into the first big area, defining and classifying cancer. And it might sound strange given all the research that's been done,
It might.
but the sources point out that we still haven't arrived at a single unified scientific classification of cancer.
That's right. It's not as straightforward as you might think.
It's like we all know cancer is a serious disease, but pinning down exactly what makes it cancer is actually a lot more complicated than it appears.
You've hit the nail on the head there. We tend to think of scientific classification as this neat hierarchy, right?
Yeah, like the periodic table for elements.
Exactly. But with cancer, there isn't that one definitive system. You see different approaches being used. Some classifications are hierarchical based on where the cancer originates in the body.
Okay, so like lung cancer, breast cancer, those sorts of categories.
Precisely. But then you have other classifications that are cross-cutting.
Cross-cutting, what does that mean?
Well, they group cancers based on shared molecular features, even if they arise in different tissues. For example, you might have breast cancer and lung cancer that share a certain genetic mutation.
Interesting. So it's not just about location anymore. It's about the underlying molecular changes.
Right. And initially, there was this hope that genomics, looking at the molecular subtypes of cancer, would finally give us that clear, unified system.
Yeah, it seems like that would make sense, right? Get down to the genetic level and find the common denominators.
You'd think so, but it turns out it actually made things more complicated.
How so?
Well, it gave us a much more detailed picture, which is great. But it also revealed an incredible amount of what we call heterogeneity.
Heterogeneity. So basically, cancers are even more diverse than we initially thought.
Exactly. And this raises some fundamental philosophical questions. What makes one classification system better than another? Is it just about practical usefulness in the clinic? Like, does it help us choose the right treatment? Or is there some deeper principle at play here? Something about capturing what we might call natural distinctions in the world of disease? Are we trying to carve nature at its joints, so to speak?
That's a really interesting question. Because, like you said, cancer itself is just so diverse, and the sources talk about this inherent heterogeneity in cancer,
They do.
and they break it down into two types. Intertumor heterogeneity, which is the differences between tumors in different patients.
Even if they have the same type of cancer, like breast cancer.
And then there's intertumor heterogeneity.
Right, which means that even within the same tumor, in the same patient, different cells can have different mutations.
Wow. So it's like each tumor is its own little ecosystem of different cell populations.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, the entry discusses the work of the TCGA project, the Cancer Genome Atlas.
Okay, I've heard of that. It's a massive effort to map the genomes of different cancers, right?
Yes. And their work on head and neck squamous cell carcinomas really highlights this complexity. They found specific mutations that are associated with cancers caused by HPV infection, as opposed to those caused by smoking.
So that's helpful from a clinical standpoint, right? Knowing the underlying cause can guide treatment decisions.
Absolutely. But the bigger picture that emerged from this and other studies was that there are just so many mutations in cancer genomes. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
And the challenge is figuring out which ones are the real drivers of the disease.
Precisely. Sorting out the signal from the noise, as the entry puts it, has been a major hurdle.
And it gets even more complex when you realize that a single tumor isn't this uniform mass of cells.
No, not at all.
It can have multiple populations of cells, each evolving in its own way with its own set of mutations. So even if you do a biopsy, you might not be getting a complete picture of what's going on.
You're absolutely right. And then you have to consider what we call context-dependent effects.
Context-dependent effects.
Meaning that a mutation that might seem insignificant on its own could suddenly become a huge advantage for the cancer cells under certain conditions.
Like what?
Like when chemotherapy is introduced. The mutation might give those cells resistance to the drug, allowing them to survive and proliferate while other cells die off.
Oh, I see. So it's like the environment, the context of the treatment is actually shaping the evolution of the cancer.
Exactly. And another layer of complexity is the order in which mutations occur. The entry gives the example of myeloproliferative neoplasms, a type of blood cancer.
Okay.
The specific sequence of mutations can dramatically change how the disease progresses and what the outcome is for the patient.
It seems like the more we learn about cancer, the more complicated it gets.
It does, doesn't it? And we haven't even talked about all the factors beyond genes that play a role.
Right, because it's not just about the genes themselves, is it? The sources mention all these extra genomic factors.
They do.
Things like microRNAs, which are these little molecules that regulate gene expression, a person's life history, their environmental exposures, infections like HPV or hepatitis C, hormone levels, even inherited predispositions and habits like smoking. It makes you wonder which of these causal factors should be central to how we classify cancer. Is there even a right way to categorize this incredibly diverse landscape?
That's the million-dollar question. And this leads us into the philosophical debate about whether diseases like cancer are even natural kinds in the first place.
Okay, let's dive into that. What does it mean for something to be a natural kind? And why is there even a question about whether cancer fits that bill?
Well, in philosophy, natural kinds are these categories that are thought to reflect genuine divisions in nature. They have these essential properties that make them what they are.
Like gold. It's always gold no matter what form it's in.
Exactly. And the idea is that natural kinds can support reliable generalizations and even scientific laws. But some philosophers argue that diseases, especially complex ones like cancer, don't really fit this model.
I see. So they're saying that maybe cancer as a category is more of a human construct than a reflection of some fundamental natural division.
That's one way of looking at it. The entry gives the example of Lange, a philosopher who suggests that a disease is a natural kind of incapacity,
Okay.
meaning that we understand a disease by looking at how it disrupts normal biological functions. But he's skeptical that cancer really fits this definition.
Why is that?
Well, because the disruptions we see in cancer, like uncontrolled cell growth, can happen in so many different ways at the molecular level. And with modern medicine increasingly focused on these molecular subtypes, which might not all have unifying functional explanations, he even proposes that we might be seeing the end of diseases as natural kinds.
Wow. So our very concept of what constitutes a disease might be dissolving as we get deeper into the molecular complexities of cancer.
That's the argument he's making.
Okay. And then there's Sorensen, another philosopher who has a different perspective.
Right. Sorensen offers this idea of diseases as paranatural kinds.
Paranatural kinds.
Yeah. His argument is that because diseases are fundamentally deficiencies or departures from the norm, they don't have that inherent integrity that we associate with true natural kinds.
I see. So they're more like shadows of those underlying natural processes, reflections of things going wrong.
Precisely. But then, of course, you have philosophers like Broadbent and Khalidi who take yet another approach.
Right. They're not convinced that diseases can't be considered natural kinds.
Exactly. Broadbent proposes what he calls a contrastive model of disease.
Okay.
He argues that diseases are distinct based on their distinctive causes. So if you have two groups of people, one with the disease and one without, and you can identify a clear causal difference between those groups, then that disease can be considered a distinct entity.
Interesting. So it's about identifying those specific causal factors that set the disease apart.
Exactly. He gives the example of cervical cancer, which is very strongly linked to HPV infection. You can compare that to someone who has a temporary HPV infection that doesn't develop into cancer.
So the difference in the causal story, the presence of HPV in one group and not the other, is what defines the disease.
Right. And this raises a point you touched on earlier, the role of potential dysfunction in how we classify disease.
Yeah.
From a public health perspective, even identifying an asymptomatic state like HPV infection can be crucial for prevention, even if not everyone with HPV develops cancer.
Yeah.
So the purpose of our classification, whether it's explaining the past or guiding future actions, really matters.
It's not just an abstract philosophical exercise. It has real-world implications.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Then there's Khalidi, who brings in the idea of cancer as a homeostatic property cluster kind.
Homeostatic property cluster.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But the basic idea is that cancer is driven by mutations in caretaker genes. These are the genes that normally prevent tumor growth and keep our genome stable.
Okay.
So when these genes are mutated, it allows cancer cells to develop a cluster of characteristic properties, what Hanahan and Weinberg famously called the hallmarks of cancer.
I've heard of those, like self-sufficiency and growth signals, evasion of cell death, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And the tumor suppressor gene, TP53, is a great example of a caretaker gene. Mutations in TP53 are found in a huge range of cancers.
So initially, this homeostatic property cluster view seemed like a promising way to understand cancer.
It did.
Ah.
But as we've learned more, especially about the tumor microenvironment.
Right, the surrounding cells and tissues that influence the tumor.
Yes. And the fact that the effects of mutations are often context-dependent, this view has faced some challenges.
Like what?
Well, for instance, the entry mentions that many normal skin cells in older individuals have similar caretaker gene mutations as tumor cells, but they don't develop cancer.
So the same mutation can have very different outcomes depending on the environment.
Exactly. It's not just about the genes themselves, it's about how they interact with their surroundings.
And of course, we can't forget the rise of network analysis and artificial intelligence in trying to classify cancer.
Oh, yes. Big data and AI are changing everything.
We're generating massive amounts of data about cancer genomes, gene expression, protein interactions, you name it. And AI algorithms are being used to try to find patterns in all that data and develop new classification systems.
Right. The hope is that these methods will help us identify new subtypes of cancer, predict how individual patients will respond to different treatments, and ultimately develop more effective therapies.
It sounds incredibly promising. But the entry also points out that philosophers of science are raising some important questions about these approaches.
They are.
Like, how representative is the data? Are we really capturing the full complexity of cancer?
Good point.
How is the data being labeled, and could those labels be introducing biases? And the fact that genomic data is often just a snapshot in time of a disease that is constantly evolving and being influenced by its environment.
Those are all important considerations, and it's crucial to have those philosophical voices challenging those assumptions and making sure we're not getting ahead of ourselves.
So it seems like the big takeaway from this whole discussion about classification is that there's no single, easy answer.
That's right.
There's no one right way to categorize cancer. It's complex, it's heterogeneous, and it might require us to embrace a more pluralistic approach.
A more flexible approach that acknowledges the different levels of analysis, the different goals we have, and the inherent limitations of any single classification system.
And this really makes you think about the very aims of classification in biomedicine.
It does.
Are we looking for these underlying essences, these fundamental, unchanging categories? Or are we trying to create classifications that are the most useful for understanding, predicting, and treating disease?
Maybe it's a bit of both.
Maybe. But the fact that we're even having this debate shows just how complex and challenging the concept of cancer really is. And just when you think you're starting to get your head around classifying cancer, the sources throw in another curveball.
Which is?
The variable natural history of the disease. Not all cancers are these aggressive, rapidly progressing killers.
That's right. Some cancers can be very slow growing.
Like many prostate and thyroid cancers.
Exactly. They can remain indolent for a person's entire life, never really causing any problems.
And this raises a really interesting debate. Should we even be classifying these early-stage, slow-growing lesions as cancer at all?
It's a legitimate question. Some argue that they should be considered risk factors, not actual diseases, especially if they're not causing any harm.
The entry highlights the work of Peter Schwartz, a philosopher who draws on Bors's biostatistical theory of disease,
Right.
which defines disease as a departure from normal biological function.
So if these slow-growing lesions aren't actually impairing function, are they really diseases?
That's the argument. And Schwartz suggests that reclassifying these as risk factors could help prevent overdiagnosis and overtreatment.
Which are huge problems in medicine, especially in cancer.
Diagnosing and treating something that might never have caused any problems for the patient.
It's a very real concern. But of course, there are other perspectives on this issue. Some argue that the act of diagnosis itself involves this inherent risk-benefit calculation.
Right. You have to weigh the potential benefits of early detection and treatment against the potential harms of overdiagnosis and overtreatment.
And there's a lot of uncertainty involved, especially with these slow-growing cancers. We don't always know which ones will become aggressive and which ones will remain indolent.
So there's a normative dimension to diagnosis and classification, right? The labels we use have real consequences for patients, for doctors, for insurance companies, for the whole healthcare system.
Absolutely. The word cancer carries a lot of weight. It can cause anxiety, fear, and even lead to unnecessary medical interventions.
The hope, of course, is that precision medicine, with its focus on identifying biomarkers of aggressive disease, will help us resolve some of these ambiguities.
That's the promise. But as we discussed earlier, interpreting complex genomic data isn't always straightforward.
Right. So it seems like we're left with this idea, as the philosopher Dupree puts it, of promiscuous realism.
Interesting term. What does he mean by that?
Well, he's acknowledging the fact that diseases like cancer don't have these neat, clear-cut essences.
Right.
They're heterogeneous, they have blurry boundaries, multiple causes, and variable dynamics.
So maybe we have to accept that our classifications will always be somewhat messy and subject to change as our knowledge grows and our priorities shift.
Maybe that's just the nature of dealing with complex biological phenomena. Okay, so we've seen just how complex and debated the very definition of cancer is.
It's a lot to take in.
Now, let's move on to another fundamental question. How do scientists actually explain this incredibly multifaceted set of diseases?
Right. How do we go beyond just describing cancer and start to understand its underlying causes and mechanisms?
Exactly. And the sources point out that even this seemingly simple question is more complicated than it appears. What does it even mean to explain cancer?
Yeah, what are we actually trying to explain? Are we looking for a general explanation of the cancer process itself? Or are we trying to explain specific phenomena like metastasis, the spread of cancer to other parts of the body?
Or why certain cancers are more common in certain populations?
Right. The level of explanation we're seeking really matters.
And it seems like the dominant approach in cancer research for the past few decades has been what the sources call the mechanistic picture.
The mechanistic picture.
Yeah, and this focuses on understanding the cellular and molecular mechanisms that regulate cell birth and death.
Okay. So how cells divide, how they grow, how they die.
Exactly. And the idea is that cancer arises from disruptions in this delicate machinery. It's like a breakdown in the normal checks and balances that control cell behavior.
Leading to uncontrolled growth and a failure of cells to self-destruct, a process called apoptosis.
Right. And the somatic mutation theory or multi-stage theory of cancer fits right into this mechanistic framework.
So this theory basically says that cancer develops through the accumulation of mutations in a cell's DNA over time.
Exactly. These mutations can be caused by a variety of factors, like inherited genes, exposure to carcinogens like tobacco smoke or radiation, even just errors that happen naturally during DNA replication.
And each mutation can give the cell a slight advantage, allowing it to grow a little faster, divide a little more often, or evade the normal mechanisms of cell death.
And over time, as these mutations accumulate, the cells become more and more abnormal, eventually leading to full-blown cancer.
And the entry even traces the historical development of this theory, from Virchow's early observations of cellular changes in cancer to the discovery of the first oncogene, the SRC gene.
An oncogene being a gene that has the potential to cause cancer.
Right. And this oncogene paradigm really shifted the focus of cancer research towards these specific genetic changes.
It was a move away from an earlier regulatory view of cancer that focused more on broader physiological imbalances in the body.
So more of a systems-level view.
Yeah, kind of. And the work of Vogelstein on familial bowel cancer is a classic example of this mechanistic approach in action.
Right. He was able to identify a step-by-step accumulation of mutations in specific genes that led to the development of colon cancer.
And this focus on identifying the parts and processes at the molecular level aligns with what philosophers of science call the new mechanist view.
which emphasizes the importance of describing mechanisms as a central goal of biology.
Right. If we want to understand how something works, we need to understand the parts involved and how they interact with each other.
It makes sense. But the sources also point out that this purely mechanistic picture has its limitations.
And its critics.
Of course, even within the mechanistic framework, as philosophers like Bechtel have argued, we need to consider the complex organization of those mechanisms.
Not just the individual parts, but how they fit together and regulate each other.
Exactly. We have to think about feedback loops, control mechanisms, and the hierarchical nature of biological systems.
And this brings us to some alternative perspectives on cancer, like the tissue organization field theory proposed by Soto and Sonnenschein.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, they challenge the primary focus on genetic mutations as the main drivers of cancer.
So they're saying it's not all about the genes.
Right. They argue that cancer arises from more fundamental alterations in the way cells communicate with each other and how tissues are organized.
Interesting.
They propose this idea of downward causation, where changes at the level of tissue organization can actually influence gene expression and even lead to mutations.
This is like the environment is shaping the genes rather than the other way around.
Exactly. And they're also critical of the heavy reliance on cell culture and animal models in cancer research.
Because those artificial environments might not accurately reflect the complex interactions that happen within a living organism.
Right. And their idea of downward causation has generated a lot of discussion among philosophers of science.
How so?
Well, it raises questions about the traditional hierarchy of causation in biology. Does it always go from genes to cells to tissues to organs? Or can higher level properties, like the organization of a tissue, actually influence the behavior of the lower level components?
It's a really fundamental question about how biological systems work. And it's fascinating to see how this debate is playing out in the context of cancer research.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that there's no consensus on how these different theories relate to each other.
Right.
Some researchers see the somatic mutation theory and the tissue organization field theory as fundamentally incompatible. Like, you have to choose one or the other.
A paradigm shift kind of situation.
Yeah. But others argue that they might actually be complementary, that mutations and tissue organization both play important roles, and we need to understand how they interact.
It makes sense that both could be important. Biology is rarely that simple.
Right. And to add even more complexity, the entry also brings in the tumor microenvironment.
Right, the ecosystem of cells, blood vessels, and supporting tissues that surrounds the tumor.
Exactly. And we're only just beginning to understand how the spatial organization of the microenvironment, how it changes over time, and how it interacts with the tumor cells all contribute to cancer progression.
It's like a whole other level of complexity on top of everything else we've been discussing.
It is. And then there's the cancer stem cell theory, which proposes that a small subpopulation of cells within a tumor are responsible for driving its growth.
Oh, I've heard of those. The idea is that these stem cells are like the seeds of the tumor, constantly producing new cancer cells.
Exactly. And this theory has its roots in an earlier developmental view of cancer that saw similarities between cancer cells and embryonic cells, both having this capacity for rapid growth and differentiation.
So, are these cancer stem cells thought to be derived from normal stem cells that have gone awry?
That's one possibility. But another possibility is that more differentiated cancer cells can actually acquire stem-like properties, a concept known as plasticity.
So the boundaries between different cell types might be more fluid than we once thought.
Exactly. And this makes it even more challenging to target these cells therapeutically.
Because if they can switch back and forth between different states, it makes them harder to eliminate.
Right. And this whole discussion about cancer stem cells highlights another layer of complexity in how we try to explain cancer. It's not just about identifying mutations, it's also about understanding the different cell populations within a tumor, their origins, and their roles in driving the disease.
It's like trying to understand the dynamics of a whole ecosystem, not just the individual species within it.
Exactly. So this whole section on explanation really underscores the fact that there are competing fundamental assumptions and different levels of analysis at play in cancer research. And the philosophical work of clarifying those concepts, examining the different kinds of explanations being offered, and figuring out how new data fits into these frameworks is absolutely essential for making progress in understanding cancer.
It's like philosophy is providing the conceptual scaffolding for the scientific work.
Exactly. It helps us make sense of the complexity and avoid getting lost in the details. Which brings us to the third major philosophical area highlighted in the sources, viewing cancer through the lens of evolution and development.
Okay, so now we're zooming out even further, looking at cancer in the context of the history of life itself.
Exactly. The entry quotes Dobzhansky, who famously said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." So how does an evolutionary perspective help us understand something like cancer, which seems like this fundamental breakdown of biological control?
It does seem paradoxical, right? How can something that's so clearly dysfunctional be related to evolutionary processes, which are supposed to be about adaptation and survival?
Right. But the entry explores this very question. Is cancer an unavoidable byproduct of development or aging? Could our evolutionary history actually explain why we're vulnerable to it?
Fascinating.
One way to think about it is through the lens of comparative biology. By looking at cancer rates and mechanisms across different species, we can start to see patterns and maybe get some clues about why certain organisms are more or less susceptible.
Okay, so like comparing humans to other primates, or even to very different animals like elephants.
Exactly. Elephants, for example, have surprisingly low cancer rates despite their large size and long lifespans. So what's going on there? Are there protective mechanisms we can learn from?
That's a great example. And then there's the field of evolutionary medicine, which specifically looks at how our own evolutionary history might have left us vulnerable to certain diseases.
Right, like the idea of mismatches between our evolved biology and our modern environment.
So our bodies might be adapted to a lifestyle that's very different from how we live today, and they could create vulnerabilities to certain diseases.
Exactly. The entry does caution us about some of the more simplistic adaptationist assumptions in evolutionary medicine.
Meaning, not everything is an adaptation.
Right. But the examples they give, like the potential link between not having children and increased breast cancer risk, are definitely thought-provoking.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, the idea is that our bodies evolved in a context of more frequent and prolonged pregnancies. So the hormonal and physiological changes associated with pregnancy might actually have protective effects against breast cancer.
Interesting. So not having children might disrupt those protective mechanisms.
That's the hypothesis. Of course, there are other factors to consider and more research is needed, but it highlights how an evolutionary perspective can generate new hypotheses and insights into disease.
And the entry also explores this fascinating idea about cancer being a byproduct of the very emergence of multicellularity.
Right. Hundreds of millions of years ago, life made this incredible leap from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms.
And that created a whole new set of challenges.
Exactly. You now have all these cells living together, cooperating to form a single organism. But that requires incredibly sophisticated mechanisms to prevent any cell from going rogue and proliferating uncontrollably.
Because that could undermine the whole organism.
Exactly. So cancer, in this view, could be seen as a result of breakdowns in these fundamental mechanisms that evolved to maintain multicellular life.
It's like a revolt from within.
Exactly. And this idea actually connects to some deep philosophical discussions about the nature of biological individuality.
Oh, interesting.
Like what makes a multicellular organism a single entity rather than just a collection of cells? How do we define the boundaries of an individual?
It's a question that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
And the evolutionary perspective on cancer sheds new light on this debate.
It's amazing how all these different areas of thought are interconnected.
And the evolutionary view doesn't necessarily contradict the somatic mutation theory either.
Right.
They can be seen as complementary. The mutations that drive cancer often disrupt those very regulatory pathways that evolved to prevent uncontrolled growth.
So the mutations are the proximate cause, but the ultimate cause might lie in those deeper evolutionary constraints.
Exactly. And the entry also explores the idea of cancer itself as an evolutionary process.
So the cancer cells within a tumor are evolving and adapting over time.
Right. Just like populations of organisms evolve in response to their environment, cancer cells evolve in response to the conditions within the body.
Like the selective pressure of chemotherapy.
Exactly. Chemotherapy drugs kill off sensitive cells, but resistant cells survive and proliferate, leading to drug resistance.
It's like natural selection in action, but happening inside the body.
And this has led to some really interesting research on how to predict and overcome drug resistance by understanding the evolutionary dynamics of cancer.
So we can use evolutionary principles to fight cancer.
Exactly. And the analogy of cancer cells being selfish or cheaters within the multicellular society of the body is also explored in the entry.
Right, the idea that they're breaking the rules of cooperation that normally keep the organism functioning properly.
Exactly. But there's debate about whether this analogy is really accurate, especially considering that many cancers are evolutionary dead ends.
Meaning they don't get passed on to offspring.
Right. So the genes that drive the cancer aren't actually benefiting from their selfish behavior.
It's a really interesting philosophical question about how we define selfishness and cooperation in these complex biological systems.
It is. And finally, the entry touches on the idea of cancer as a disease of aging.
Which makes sense. Cancer rates generally increase with age.
Right. And this could be due to a number of factors, like the accumulation of mutations over time, the decline of the immune system with age, and the breakdown of those tissue-level control mechanisms we discussed earlier.
So aging itself could be a risk factor for cancer.
And this raises some even deeper philosophical questions about how we define function and dysfunction at different scales of biological organization and over different time scales in an organism's life.
Wow, it's like cancer is a window into these fundamental questions about the nature of life itself.
It really is. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how complex and multifaceted the concept of cancer is, how it challenges our traditional ways of classifying and explaining disease, and how it forces us to think about the interplay of genes, environment, and evolution. But there's one more crucial area we need to explore:
Which is?
the intersection of science, values, and the aims of cancer research. It's easy to think of science as this purely objective enterprise, but the sources make it clear that values inevitably played a role, especially in a field like cancer research.
Right, because cancer is such a personal and emotionally charged disease, it touches everyone's lives in some way.
Exactly. And when you have that level of personal and societal investment, it's impossible to completely separate science from values.
I see.
The entry starts by looking at epidemiological and toxicological research, which aims to identify carcinogens, things that can cause cancer. This research is used to inform public health policy, regulations, even legal decisions about liability.
Like banning certain chemicals or setting safety standards for workplaces.
Exactly. But the evidence in these cases is often indirect. It's based on population studies or animal models, and there's always a degree of uncertainty.
Right. You can't always do controlled experiments on humans.
And so decisions about what level of evidence is sufficient to declare something a carcinogen and what precautions should be taken as a result inevitably involve value judgments.
Judgments about acceptable levels of risk, about how much evidence is enough to justify action.
Exactly. And this leads to